A weirdly common problem in Final Fantasy XIV, possibly especially because of the age of the game combined with the amount of changes the game has got over the years, is that some players will claim that something is true without ever checking if it actually is. Either because they assumed it is the way they think, or because it was like that at some point. Welcome to Final Fantasy XIV Mythbusters, where I and my friends highlight the odd claims and misconceptions players make, and test them to see whether they are true or not, while also explaining how you can test it yourself so you can learn how to science stuff in Final Fantasy XIV. Number 1. Spinning mobs does not make them swing slower in content after patch 3.4 or something. This one is quite interesting, because the trick of spinning mobs plays with how mobs line up their auto attacks in Final Fantasy XIV. Mobs only really care about whether they are facing you correctly when their auto attack is available, meaning that they will just stare wherever they are looking until they have something new to use on you. The claim originates from the fact that once they do have something for you, they can almost instantly snap to face you, especially in newer content. However, it turns out that this snap requires that the monster is looking at least partly in your direction. And it also seems to be related to latency, as standing directly behind the enemy is actually less effective than being slightly further towards the side the enemy is not currently turning towards. However, it does in fact seem to delay attacks slightly. The noteworthy thing is that it delays it by very little on most enemies it happens to work on. And indeed, it doesn't appear to consistently work on everything. However, the original claim explicitly said patch 3.4, and Shisui of the Violet Tides is from patch 4.0, and this mob can be spun. Meanwhile, the bears in Holminster Switch from 5.0 either can't be spun or are extra resistant to it. Simultaneously, this random dragon and Endwalker content can also be spun, so this isn't entirely consistent, as you can see. It is worth pointing out that most mobs this works on, you need to do it perfectly for it to add any value at all, and even when you do it right, it doesn't delay them by that much. So I heavily advise against doing this at all when you are in a group with anyone else. Now, in extension of that, number 2. Mobs run faster than players, so kiting does nothing. Like I said before, mobs don't actually bother checking whether they are in range to swing at you until they have a swing ready to swing at you. So if you generate enough distance before they're ready to swing, you can actually delay their attack for quite a while. And if you're fast enough, because not all mobs outrun sprint, you can delay this swing almost indefinitely. Unless you're ranged, this of course comes with a massive downside that you can't really attack yourself while doing this. However, there are times where this is useful. For example, if you are a tank and your healer just needs a second more to heal you, or the upcoming tank buster with a cast time will kill you if you can't delay it by a second or two, then just running can often give you exactly that amount of time. So if you've ever seen a tank start fleeing when they fall at low HP, it does actually work. And yes, just to follow up on the other half of the original claim, some mobs run faster than players, but mobs actually appear to have varying run speeds. Also, naturally, running away from a tank buster doesn't help if the tank buster comes with a gap closer, which they sometimes do. Number 3. Standard finish does not stack. Okay, so standard step and standard finish is very unique in its functionality. Standard finish grants both the user and their dance partner a standard finish buff, which appears entirely identical both in name, icon, and functionality. However, one thing worth considering is that the closed position action applies a different giver and receiver buff, which means that two dancers using closed position on each other will result in two different dance partner buffs on both dancers. This should be an indicator already. Now, that's all well and good, but the real question is whether standard finish's buff actually stacks. It is entirely possible that you receive two separate standard finish buffs and they just simply won't work. As such, to test this, first determine how much damage an attack actually does from a dancer. We will use Windmill as that gives us at least 3 targets to maximize the number of hits we can observe. Then, once we use standard finish, we observe the difference in damage. Then, we have a second dancer use standard finish, and again observe the difference in damage. As these are damage increasing buffs, they stack multiplicatively, so 2 standard finishes will lead to a combined 10.25% damage increase rather than just 10%. Something that is worth keeping in mind though, is that Devilment and Technical Finish do not stack in the same way. So even if 2 dancers can partner up, they will still face a massive waste of cooldowns if they don't intentionally displace their cooldowns from each other. I should also mention that the reason standard finish stacks with itself in this way is because the giver and receiver standard finish buffs are apparently designed as 2 separate buffs. This does also mean, however, that 2 dancers partnering the same target will not double up, because that would mean 2 of the same receiver buff. Number 4. Dungeon group, 2 dancer DPS. Who do you partner with? Each other? So this one is complicated, and I honestly think that the real answer depends heavily on your group, and so at best I can give some considerations. While this isn't outright a claim like the others, it still builds on the previous claim. However, with that said, we have a few different options, assuming that both dancers are trying to work together, which is ultimately often what the real problem is. Given that most jobs have a smaller burst on the odd minute and then a bigger one on the even minute, it would actually be beneficial if one of the dancers delay their technical finish and potentially also their devilment by 1 minute. This would mean, for example, that your tank would have technical finish for every burst, whether that's inner release, fight or flight, no mercy or delirium. So with that assumption, we have the following ways the dance partners can be chosen. Dancers partner each other. 1 dancer partners the tank, the other the healer. 1 dancer partners the other dancer, and the other dancer partners the tank. Technically, you could also say that there's the same option but with a healer instead, but tanks do more damage than healers, so there would be no point in doing that. Unless of course the healer's really strong and the tank is really weak gear-wise or skill-wise. The configurations where there is any overlap at all in dance partner would require that devilment is displaced from each other to ever be worth it. So that means that if the 2 dancers are using their cooldowns at the same time, it would be most beneficial for 1 dancer to partner the tank and the other the healer so that devilment doesn't go to waste. Optimally, devilment on its own is worth like 17% more damage on each player, which is massive enough that unless the healer is outright not attacking, it is generally worth putting on them. The only case where I think it might possibly not be worth it is if the healer is an Astrologian, simply because of Astrologian's much lower personal damage. However, at the same time, Astrologian also providing a raid buff also gives reason to stack devilment in the same burst window, which would then circle back around and give the dancers reason to at least use that at the same time. If, on the other hand, the dancers are working together and making sure devilment and technical finish comes out every minute as a result, then it is worth considering the fact that dancer does more DPS in a dungeon than a tank or a healer would. At least, assuming everyone is playing optimally and are geared equally. As such, the dancers partnering with each other would probably be the most effective. Now, I will admit that most of this is based on very broad estimates, because there are so many things to account for in a dungeon that a clear answer might be hard to get. Is it lunar subterrane we're talking about? Or is it something weird like Lapis Manalis, where the first few pulls are super awkward? These things can mess up cooldown timings as well. And you could argue that the potential DPS loss of one of the dancers essentially postponing their first big burst by 60 seconds is irrelevant, because the rest of the party going full blast compensates in the first big pull, and then this dancer can compensate a bit in the second big pull. However, I hope some of my considerations at least give some food for thought. To summarize, if you are not working together with your co-dancer to split your buff timings, then it is probably better to split the dance partners across the entire team, so at least everyone gets devilment. If you are working with your co-dancer, then doubling up on each other is more beneficial due to DPS jobs being better at maximizing the value of the buffs. Weirdly, this is more about devilment than standard finish in some ways. I don't think this specific situation is something that has a one-size-fits-all that can be used everywhere, so I would love to hear if you have some ideas for what else should be considered. Number 5. PvP Monk's Meteodrive ignores guard. Now, everything in the tooltip would suggest that Meteodrive doesn't work this way. It literally says if guard is up, it removes it, and if it is not, then it does extra damage. The problem is in the order of operations. First, Meteodrive initiates its attack, where it will deal 12k damage over 3 hits. During that, it then removes guard. Then, it also applies the Meteodrive effect, which is the 3-second stun while you're actively being punched. And then, it checks if you have guard, and if you don't, it does 12k more. Incidentally, most of the time, you won't have guard because it was removed by Meteodrive. In other words, what Meteodrive actually does is deal 12k damage over 3 seconds, removes guard from the target, stuns them for 3 seconds, and then deals 12k damage when the stun ends. The only way for Meteodrive to actually miss those extra 12k is due to latency issues. Number 6. Rescue cancels Raise Invulnerability. So in episode 3 of this series, we demonstrated that Transcendence is removed by the receiver of the buff doing anything other than moving. This claim suggests that being rescued by someone else also removes it. This is rather easy to test. Enter combat in a boss fight so that everyone involved stays in combat through death. Then have a blue mage use self-destruct. Make sure the boss doesn't die as a result, and then have a healer raise the blue mage. Once they're up, use rescue on them before the Transcendence buff ends. Notice that the buff stays. In fact, you can see here that Thesa doesn't even take damage from the AoE that I rescued them into. Number 7. Cover ignores defensive buffs on the paladin entirely because the damage is redirected as is from the original receiver. This comes off the back of episode 3's demonstration of Hallowed Ground not working with cover. That the additional claim is, obviously it doesn't work. It doesn't work with any defensive cooldown, which isn't true. You can demonstrate this in the exact same way as the Hallowed Ground example. Have your chocobo tank something and then simply use cover on it. Notice that not only is the damage not the same, but is reduced because you have more defense than your chocobo does. Furthermore, if you use Sentinel, the damage is reduced further, and if you add on Rampart, it is even further reduced. Number 8. Defensive cooldowns stack additively. This one typically stems more so from a wish than an observation, because it would be way funnier if defensive cooldowns stacked additively. What this would mean is if you used, say, Sentinel and Rampart, you would reduce damage taken by 50%. Now, for this to even work, the game would have to pass on, as an additional piece of information, what the base damage of the attack was when it landed, so that each individual defensive cooldown can take its part to result in this additive reduction. Or, alternatively, each buff would have to be added together as some sort of damage reduction number on the user. Both things are far more complicated than simply having the damage be gradually reduced by each cooldown, one at a time. Multiplicative stacking. In addition to this, if defensive cooldowns stacked additively, then it would mean that Reprisal does not stack that way because it would reduce the original damage by 10% before it reaches you. Finally, if defensive cooldowns stacked additively, then a Gunbreaker using Nebula, Rampart, Heart of Corundum, and Camouflage would take 90% less damage from an attack. If, on the other hand, defensive cooldowns stack multiplicatively, this same combo would instead result in taking 64% less damage, meaning a broad estimate is that the attack would do about a third of its original damage. You can simply test this by walking up to a mob, let it hit you a few times with a predictable attack, and then use all of those defensive cooldowns as the attack lines up, and notice that the attack does not get reduced by 90%. Number 9. Blocks and parries add their damage reduction additively after all other damage reduction. I'm not sure how this claim came to be, but I have seen it a few times. What this suggests is that if an attack does, say, 10,000 damage to you before damage reduction, and you then reduce the damage through various means, then blocking the hit, which typically is 20%, would always remove 2,000 of the damage, as that would be 20% of the original hit. Knowing this, we can use the same demonstration technique as the previous one, against a blockable attack. As a paladin, get hit a bunch of times by the blockable attack, preferably also check how much it does when you block, then use all of your defensives, Sentinel, Rampart, Holy Sheltron, and observe how much it does then. Then do it all again, except use Bulwark to make sure you also block the attack. Observe that the damage is simply reduced by 20% of what it was without blocking. Part of what makes a claim like this come about is that blocking can feel rather mediocre given that you can't even block dots, and it is somewhat unpredictable. So it stands to reason that some players might assume there's simply something we're all missing and blocking is better than you think. It's really not, unfortunately. For those curious, paladins in appropriate max level gear and shield have a 30% chance to block 20% damage. This varies slightly in synced content, and if your shield is not appropriate for your level. All jobs have a 10% chance to parry 15% of physical damage. You can block magic, but you cannot parry magic. Number 10. Potions and other percentage-based healing effects are increased by healing increasing effects. Percentage-based healing includes Protraction, Benediction, and Thrill of Battle, and we only really need to test one of them. Potions are not considered actions, and all healing increasing effects we can access normally say increases HP recovery via healing actions by X%. As such, we need something else. The echo when doing unsynced content describes the stat bonus as damage dealt, healing potency, and maximum HP are increased by X%. So we can hope that helps? Either way, potions are capped at their listed maximum. So, if percentage-based healing is affected by healing bonuses, then if we enter Sastasha unsynced, we enter with 300% more HP and 300% more healing done. Which means that Protraction technically should heal us for 40% of our HP and not just 10%. You can see here that it is still just 10%. Similarly, we can bring Bard into Sastasha unsynced and remove all gear to land at just 12k HP. Then a Hyper Potion would normally heal for 25% of that, which is 3126 in this particular example. But if the healing bonus from unsynced affects it, it should be 4 times that, which would mean either 12,504 or 11,000 if its actual cap still remains in effect. Well, it is actually just 3,126. Additionally, we can also use Nature's Min and observe that that bonus doesn't do anything either. Now that is all for this video, thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact: Echo Drops is a common medicine you can buy at your Grand Company that removes silence, and seems to work on any silence that could be removed with the Suna. Spinal Drops is a different medicine that is supposed to work the same way, but for paralysis effects. However, it turns out Spinal Drops do not work on all paralysis effects that are removable by Isuna, but only some of them.